When Mabel Crowley dragged herself to the ranch cookhouse before dawn, violet bruises blooming beneath her sleeves, she believed three lies: that she deserved the fists, that silence kept her safe, and that no one in Dust Creek would ever look twice at a settler woman married to a gambling drunk. Then Colt Merrick, 6 feet of quiet rancher muscle, fixed her broken door hinge without being asked and said 5 words that cracked her world open. "You don't deserve hurt." In a territory where a man's wife was his property and his business stayed his own, those words were dynamite. And Royce Danner, her husband, was about to light the fuse. What happens when a battered woman finally finds someone who refuses to look away? Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment below with your city so I can see how far Mabel's journey travels across the world. The Montana Territory. Dawn came cold and unforgiving, the kind of morning that painted frost on window panes and turned breath to fog. Mabel Crowley moved through the pre-dawn darkness of the ranch cookhouse like a ghost, her movements practiced and precise, despite the throbbing ache in her left wrist. The bruises there were fresh, barely 2 days old, purple-black fingerprints that circled her forearm like a grotesque bracelet. She'd learned to favor her right hand when kneading dough, to keep her left tucked close to her body where the pain stayed manageable. The cookhouse was her kingdom and her prison. 20 feet long with a massive iron stove that ate wood faster than she could split it, rough-hewn tables that could seat 16 men at once, and shelves lined with tin plates and chipped mugs. The walls were pine plank, never quite straight, and the floor was hard-packed dirt that turned to mud when the rain leaked through the roof. It wasn't much, but it was hers from 4 in the morning until the last cowhand scraped his plate clean at supper. Those hours of flour and fire were the only ones where Royce couldn't touch her. She worked in the near darkness, preferring it to lamplight. Lamplight showed too much: the shadows under her eyes, the way she moved like something already broken, the yellowish fade of older bruises on her jaw. The cowboys who worked the Lazy M Ranch weren't cruel, but they weren't blind either. Their silence felt like judgment, though Mabel knew better. In the Montana Territory of 1887, a man's wife was his own business. What happened behind closed doors stayed there, and anyone fool enough to ask questions found themselves looking for work elsewhere. The stove came to life grudgingly under her coaxing, flames licking at kindling until the larger logs caught. Heat bloomed into the cold room, and Mabel allowed herself one moment of stillness, hands extended toward the warmth. Her wedding ring caught the firelight, a thin band of tarnished silver that had never meant love, only transaction. Royce had needed a cook and a body to warm his shack. She'd needed to eat, simple as that. "Mornin'!" The voice made her jump, pain shooting through her wrist as she jerked back from the stove. Colt Merrick stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly filling the frame. He was the Lazy M's foreman, a man of maybe 35 with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. Everything about him was solid: his frame, his reputation, his silence. In 6 months of cooking for the ranch, Mabel had heard him speak maybe 24 words. "Morning, Mr. Merrick." She kept her eyes down, reaching for the flour sack with her right hand. "Biscuits will be ready within the hour." "Not why I'm here." He stepped inside, and Mabel's heart kicked into a faster rhythm. Men in her space never meant anything good. But Colt moved past her to the door she'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks, the one that hung crooked on busted hinges and let in drafts that made the fire dance wild. He produced tools from his pockets: screwdriver, spare hinges, small nails. "Notice this was giving you trouble." "It's fine." The words came automatic, defensive. "No, it ain't." He knelt, examining the damage with those big, calloused hands. "You've been propping it with a chunk of firewood." "That's not fine. That's making do." Mabel's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him to leave it alone, that Royce would see a fixed door as charity and charity as shame, and shame always came home to her skin. But the words stuck somewhere between her chest and her mouth, so she turned back to her dough instead, kneading harder than necessary. The sound of Colt working filled the cookhouse, metal on metal, the creak of old wood, the solid thunk of a hammer he must have retrieved from his saddle. Mabel counted in her head, timing biscuits and coffee, and the moment the other hands would start drifting in, hungry and expecting. When Colt finally stood, testing the door with a satisfied nod, She'd already rolled out 3 dozen biscuits and set them to baking. Should hold now. He wiped his hands on his pants. You need anything else fixed? You let me know. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Colt looked at her then, really looked, and Mabel felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with lamplight. His eyes were gray like winter clouds, and they took in everything, the careful way she held her left arm, the high collar of her dress despite the stove's heat, the tremor in her hands that never quite went away anymore. Because, he said slowly, you deserve things that work right. Door, stove, life. He paused at the threshold, the repaired door swinging smooth on its new hinges. You don't deserve hurt, Mrs. Danner. Then he was gone, boots crunching on frost-hard ground, leaving Mabel standing in her cookhouse kingdom with tears burning behind her eyes and 5 impossible words echoing in her head. You don't deserve hurt. The hands came in for breakfast as the sun crested the eastern plains, a dozen men who smelled of horse and leather and hard work. They ate like machines, shoveling down biscuits and gravy, fried potatoes, thick slabs of bacon Mabel had rendered from a hog the week before. She kept the coffee coming, the platters full, her eyes down and her mouth shut. Safe. Invisible. Except she wasn't invisible to Colt. He sat at the far end of the long table, eating slower than the others, and twice she felt his gaze on her. Not leering, not hungry the way some men looked, just steady, watching, noticing. When the breakfast rush ended and the cowboys scattered to their day's work, Mabel began the familiar ritual of cleaning, scraping plates, hauling dishwater from the pump outside, scrubbing iron skillets with sand and elbow grease. Her wrist screamed with every twist and lift, but she'd learned years ago that pain was just weather, constant, unavoidable, something you lived through without complaint. Mabel! Royce's voice cut through the morning like a blade through butter, and every muscle in her body locked tight. He stood outside the cookhouse, swaying slightly despite the early hour. His clothes were rumpled, his hat missing, his eyes red-rimmed and mean. Gambling nights always left him this way, broke, drunk, and looking for someone to blame. She dried her hands on her apron and stepped outside, careful to close the door behind her. Private business stayed private. What do you need, Royce? Need? He laughed, a wet, ugly sound. What I need is a wife who don't shame me in front of the whole damn territory. Her stomach dropped. I haven't... Don't lie to me! He surged forward, grabbing her left arm, the bad one, and squeezing until white light burst behind her eyes. Eddie Sloan told me he seen you talking with Merrick this morning, laughing with him. I wasn't laughing. He fixed the door. The door. Royce's grip tightened, and Mabel bit her tongue to keep from crying out. What else is he fixing for you, huh? What else you giving him in trade? Nothing. Royce, please, you're hurting me. Good. He shook her hard enough to rattle her teeth. Maybe you'll remember you got a husband before you go whoring around with ranch foremen. Mabel tasted copper. She'd bitten her tongue. Around them, the ranch yard had gone quiet. Cowboys near the barn had stopped working, watching with careful, deliberate not seeing. This was private business. A man and his wife. Nobody's concern but theirs. Lost $60 last night, Royce hissed, his face so close she could smell the whiskey souring his breath. $60 I didn't have, and now I owe money I can't pay. You know what that does to a man? You know what that feels like? Let me go. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted, but steady. Please. Please. He mimicked her, cruel and childish, then shoved her backward. Mabel stumbled, catching herself against the cookhouse wall, her wrist shrieking. Get back to work, and stay away from Merrick, you hear me? Stay away from all of them. You're my wife, and I won't have you making me look like a fool. He staggered off toward the settlement of shacks beyond the ranch proper, and Mabel sagged against the rough pine planks, breathing through the pain and the shame that felt heavier than both. When she finally straightened and turned back to the cookhouse, she found Colt standing 10 feet away, his expression carved from stone. How long? He asked quietly. I don't know what you mean. How long has he been hurting you? Mabel looked away toward the mountains that ringed the valley like prison walls. That's private business, Mr. Merrick, between me and my husband. Private. The word came out flat, cold. You gonna tell me you fell down the stairs next? Walked into a door? That's what women say, isn't it, when they're covering for men who put hands on them? Heat flooded her face, anger, finally, breaking through the careful numbness she'd cultivated. What do you want me to say? That my husband drinks and gambles and takes it out on me when he loses? That some nights I sleep on the floor because climbing into bed means waking something mean? Would that make you happy, Mr. Merrick? Would that satisfy your curiosity? No. He stepped closer, and she forced herself not to flinch. What would satisfy me is seeing you safe. What would satisfy me is knowing you got choices beyond getting hit or getting hit harder. I don't have choices. The admission tasted like ash. I have a husband and a marriage and nowhere else to go. That's reality. That's life. That's horseshit. His voice dropped lower, intense. You think this is all there is? Hiding bruises and jumping at shadows? You think you deserve— Don't. She cut him off, sudden tears burning hot. Don't you dare tell me again that I don't deserve this. You don't know me. You don't know what I've done or why I'm here or what I'm paying for, so just fix your doors and shoe your horses and leave me alone. She fled inside before he could answer, slamming the repaired door behind her with a bang that felt like punctuation. On the other side, she heard him stand there breathing for a long moment before his boots retreated across the yard. Mabel pressed her forehead to the cool door frame and let herself shake. Let herself feel the crack that had opened in her careful, controlled existence. Because Colt was wrong. She didn't deserve better. Women like her, who'd married for survival instead of love, who'd traded their bodies for security and found neither, they got exactly what they'd bargained for. The afternoon stretched long and hot despite the season, the kind of day where heat shimmered off the plains and made distances lie. Mabel worked through it mechanically, bread for supper, beans soaking, beef to roast. Her wrist throbbed in time with her pulse, swelling despite the cold compresses she snuck when no one was looking. The cowboys came and went, bringing her well water and firewood without being asked, a silent kindness that might have been guilt or might have been decency. She didn't ask which. Colt didn't return to the cookhouse, and she told herself she was relieved, told herself his absence was easier than his attention. But that night, when she finally trudged the half-mile to the shack she shared with Royce at the settlement's ragged edge, she found herself looking back at the ranch. Lamplight glowed in the bunkhouse windows, warm and distant as stars. Somewhere in that light was a man who'd said impossible things. Somewhere in that light was a version of herself she couldn't quite imagine, a woman who deserved working doors and gentle hands and a life without weather. The shack was dark when she arrived, which meant Royce wasn't home yet. Probably back in town, losing money he didn't have at Moe's saloon. Mabel lit a lamp with shaking hands and surveyed her domain. One room with a sagging bed, a table missing a leg, a stove that barely heated even when fed constantly. Everything broken, everything making do. She unwrapped her wrist carefully, hissing at what she found. The swelling had turned spectacular, purple and black with an angry red edge that spoke of damage beyond simple bruising. Maybe broken. Probably broken. She'd need to bind it tight and hope it healed straight, because a doctor meant questions, and questions meant shame, and she'd swallowed enough shame for one lifetime. The door banged open near midnight, and Royce stumbled in on a cloud of whiskey fumes and rage. Mabel was still awake. She was always awake when he was out, sleep being a luxury afforded only to women who trusted their husbands. Sitting at the table with her wrist wrapped and elevated. "Look at you," he sneered, weaving toward her. "Playing wounded, trying to make me feel guilty." "I'm not trying to make you feel anything." Exhaustion made her honest. "I'm trying to make sure I can still cook come morning." "Cook." He spat the word like poison. "That's all you're good for, isn't it? Cooking and spreading your legs when I want you to. And you can't even do the second one without acting like I'm killing you." Mabel said nothing. Experience had taught her that words during these moods only fed the fire. "Eddie says Merrick was watching you again today." Royce grabbed the back of her chair, leaning close. "Says he looked ready to throw down over you. That true? You giving him ideas, making him think you're available?" "No." "No?" He laughed, bitter and broken. "You know what the boys in town say? They say Royce Danner can't even control his own wife. Say she's going to leave him for the first man who shows her attention. Say I'm a fool and a cuckold. I've never... The slap came fast, catching her cheek with enough force to knock her sideways. Pain exploded white-hot through her face, and she tasted blood again, a permanent flavor now, like copper pennies dissolving on her tongue. "You embarrass me," Royce hissed. "You make me look weak, and now you're going to make it right." He grabbed her injured wrist, twisting, and Mabel's vision went gray at the edges. The scream that tried to claw out of her throat died before it could reach air. She'd learned not to scream, learned that screaming only made men angrier, learned that silence was the last defense when everything else had failed. When Royce finally released her and collapsed onto the bed in a stupor, Mabel stayed frozen at the table, cradling her wrist and feeling something fundamental crack inside her. Not her bones. Those had broken before. Not her spirit, that had been dying by inches for years. Something else. Something that might have been hope, or might have been the last shred of belief that things could change. "You don't deserve hurt." The words echoed in the darkness, and Mabel wondered if Colt Merrick understood what he'd done. Wondered if he knew that believing such a thing, even for a moment, was more dangerous than all of Royce's fists combined. Because belief meant hope, and hope meant wanting, and wanting meant pain when reality crashed back down. She sat there until the lamp burned low, until the night turned that particular shade of darkness that comes before dawn. Then she stood, wrapped her wrist tighter, and began the walk back to the ranch cookhouse, back to her kingdom of flour and fire, back to the only hours of the day when she could pretend she was someone else. Behind her, Roy snored in the bed they'd shared for 3 bitter years. Ahead, the ranch waited with its silent cowboys and its watching foremen. And somewhere in between those 2 points, past and future, prison and possibility, Mabel Crowley walked with violet bruises hidden under her sleeves and 5 impossible words burning like brands in her memory. The morning shift began the same as always: darkness, cold, the stove's hungry maw demanding fuel. But when Mabel reached for the kindling box, she found it already full, split neat and stacked careful. A burlap sack leaned against the door, 50 pounds of flour so fresh she could smell the wheat. And on the work table, wrapped in oilcloth, a piece of ice the size of her fist. No note, no name, just the kind of quiet help that came from someone who noticed things, like how she'd been running low on flour, like how her wrist needed cold more than heat, like how splitting kindling with a damaged arm turned a simple task into an ordeal. Mabel pressed the ice to her wrist and let herself cry, just for a moment. Let herself feel the terrifying, treacherous warmth of being seen. Then she dried her eyes, stoked the fire, and began making biscuits for men who would eat them without knowing they'd been shaped by hands that were learning, slowly and painfully, to believe they might deserve more than breaking. In the ranch yard, Colt Merrick saddled his horse for the day's work, his jaw set and his mind turning over problems that couldn't be solved with tools or quiet gifts. Problems like laws that treated women as property. Problems like communities that looked away. Problems like knowing the right thing and finding the courage to do it anyway, no matter the cost. He didn't know yet that cost was coming sooner than expected. Didn't know that violence, when cornered, always bit back harder. Didn't know that saving someone sometimes meant burning down everything in the way, including the rules good men lived by. But he would learn. They both would. The Montana Territory had a way of teaching hard lessons to anyone fool enough to believe in soft things like mercy or justice, or women who deserved better than the fists they'd been dealt. And Dust Creek, for all its rough edges and rough men, was about to discover that some beliefs, once kindled, burned too hot to snuff out with threats or tradition. The storm was coming. All Mabel and Colt needed to do was survive it. The ice lasted 3 days before melting into memory, but the questions it raised lingered like smoke. Mabel moved through her cookhouse duties with mechanical precision, her wrist bound tight in strips of torn petticoat, the swelling slowly receding to reveal mottled yellow-green bruises that looked worse than they felt. She'd learned to work around pain the way other women worked around weather, inevitable, endurable, not worth mentioning, but the gifts kept coming. A jar of honey appeared on the shelf, the kind that cost real money at the mercantile. Her woodpile stayed mysteriously full despite her never splitting logs anymore. Someone, and she knew damn well who, had even patched the worst of the roof leaks with fresh tar paper, so the rain that came midweek didn't turn her floor into a mud pit. Each gift felt like a question she couldn't answer. Each act of quiet care pressed against the walls she'd built between wanting and surviving. And Mabel found herself caught between gratitude and terror. Because men who gave things expected payment, and she had nothing left to trade except the dignity she'd been hoarding like gold dust. On the fourth morning after Royce's midnight fury, Colt finally spoke to her again. The breakfast rush had ended, the hands scattered to mending fences on the North Range, and Mabel was elbow-deep in dishwater when his shadow fell across the threshold. "Your wrist healing?" She didn't turn around. "Well enough. That mean it's healing, or it means you're lying, so I'll stop asking?" "Does it matter?" She scrubbed harder at a skillet, metal scraping against cast iron. "Either way, I'll be cooking come tomorrow." "It matters to me." His boots scuffed the clean floor. She'd just swept, and then he was beside her, close enough that she could smell leather and honest sweat. "Let me see it." "Mr. Merrick, Colt." The correction came gentle but firm. "We're past formalities, don't you think? You've been crying in my cookhouse, and I've been leaving you flour. That seems like a first-name kind of arrangement." Despite everything, Mabel felt her mouth twitch towards something that might have been a smile in another life. "Your cookhouse. Last I checked, the Lazy M paid me to work here." "Last I checked, you made this place what it is. The building's just wood and nails." He waited, patient as stone, and finally Mabel surrendered, pulling her wrist from the dishwater and unwrapping the makeshift bandage with her free hand. The bruising had evolved into something almost beautiful in its horror. Purple, giving way to green, black fading to yellow, the whole mess ringed with angry red where Royce's fingers had dug deepest. The swelling had gone down, but the joint still didn't bend quite right, and touching certain spots sent lightning up her arm. Colt's jaw worked like he was chewing something tough. His hands hovered over hers, not quite touching, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough. "He did this." It wasn't a question, but Mabel answered anyway. "He was drunk. He's always drunk lately." "That's not an excuse." "I didn't say it was." She started to pull away, but Colt caught her hand, not the injured one, the other, and held it gentle as holding water. "I grew up watching my father beat my mother," he said quietly, staring at their joined hands like they held answers to questions he'd never asked aloud. "Every Saturday night, regular as church, he'd drink his pay, lose at cards, come home looking for something to break. Usually her face." Mabel's throat closed tight. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be angry." His gray eyes lifted to hers, fierce and focused. "I was 8 years old, hiding under the table, listening to her cry and beg and promise to be better. And you know what I learned? That the world's full of men who think their fists make them strong, and women who've been told so many times they're worthless that they start believing it. Your mother died when I was 12, pneumonia, the doctor said, but I knew better. She died because she was tired. Tired of hurting, tired of hiding, tired of pretending broken bones and black eyes were just bad luck." His hand tightened on hers, not painful, just present. "I swore on her grave I'd never raise a hand to a woman, and I'd never stand by silent when another man did. That's not chivalry, Mabel. That's just being human." She wanted to argue, to explain that his mother's situation and hers were different, that she'd chosen this life by marrying Royce, even knowing he was mean, that she didn't deserve rescue because she'd walked into the cage with eyes wide open. But the words tangled somewhere between her brain and tongue, and what came out instead was, "What do you want from me?" Colt studied her for a long moment, then released her hand and stepped back, giving her space she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. "I want you to know you got options. That's all. You don't have to live this way just because you started living this way. People can choose different." "Can they?" The bitterness surprised her, sharp and sudden as broken glass. "Where exactly do you think I'd go, Colt? Back to Ohio, where my family disowned me for marrying a gambler? To Billings, where no respectable house would hire a woman who left her husband? There's no different for women like me. There's just degrees of the same." "There's here." He said it simple, like offering water to someone dying of thirst. "You could stay here. Ranch always needs a cook, and I'd make damn sure nobody bothered you. And Royce? You think he'd just let me go? Let you keep me here like some kind of... She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the word that would make her feel even cheaper than she already did. Like some kind of woman who deserves safety? Colt finished for her. Yeah, I think that's exactly what you are. And if Royce has a problem with it, he can bring that problem to me. The offer hung in the air between them, dangerous and tempting as whiskey to a drunk. Mabel turned back to her dishes, plunging her hands into water gone cold and gray. You don't understand how this works. Men like Royce, they don't let go of things they think they own. He'd kill me before he'd let me leave. Or he'd kill you. Or both. Let him try. The quiet certainty in those 3 words sent ice down Mabel's spine. Don't. Don't make this about pride or honor or whatever it is men fight over. I'm not worth that. See? That's where you're wrong. Colt moved to the door, pausing with one hand on the frame. The frame he'd fixed, she remembered. The hinges he'd replaced because he'd noticed something broken and decided it mattered. You keep saying you're not worth saving, like that's some kind of fact. But I'm looking at a woman who gets up every morning despite everything, who cooks for a dozen hungry men without complaint, who hides pain so good most folks don't even see it. That's not worthless, Mabel. That's the strongest damn thing I've ever witnessed. He left before she could respond, which was probably mercy because the tears that had been building behind her eyes finally broke free in hot, silent streams. Mabel cried into the dishwater, shoulders shaking with the violence of feelings she'd kept locked down for so long they'd turned toxic. Cried for the girl she'd been before Ohio turned cold and prospects ran out. Cried for the choices that hadn't really been choices at all, just different flavors of desperation. Cried for the woman Colt seemed to see when he looked at her, someone strong, someone worth defending, someone who might actually deserve kindness instead of fists. When the tears finally ran dry, she finished the dishes with hands that trembled less than they had in weeks. Then she walked outside into the bright afternoon and looked toward the North Range where Colt had disappeared on his big bay gelding. The Montana sky stretched overhead, blue and endless and indifferent to human suffering, and Mabel made herself a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. If she survived this, if she somehow made it through whatever storm was gathering, she'd learn to believe she was worth the trouble. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, strange and fragile as spring ice. Colt kept his distance during meals, giving her space the other hands probably read as disinterest, but Mabel recognized as respect. But in the quiet hours between breakfast and lunch, or in the blue twilight after supper, she'd find him nearby, mending tack outside the cookhouse, checking fence posts that didn't need checking, inventing reasons to be present without being intrusive. They didn't talk much. Mabel had spent too many years learning that words were weapons, and Colt seemed to understand that silence could be its own kind of conversation. But sometimes, when she carried scraps out to the chickens or fetched water from the pump, their eyes would meet and hold for a moment longer than necessary. In those moments, Mabel felt something shift inside her, not love, nothing so simple or clean, but recognition. The sense of being seen by someone who looked without judgment, who noticed without demanding. Royce noticed too. Men always noticed when something they considered theirs drew attention from other men, like dogs marking territory. He didn't come to the ranch during daylight. He was too proud for that, too aware that the lazy M-hands tolerated him only because firing a woman's husband meant firing the woman too. But his visits to the shack grew more frequent and more vicious, each gambling loss translating into fresh bruises Mabel hid under long sleeves and high collars. "You fucking him yet?" Royce asked one night, shoving her against the door hard enough to rattle the frame. His breath reeked of rot-gut whiskey, and something meaner, something that smelled like desperation turning rancid. "That why you been smiling lately? Why you been walking around like you got secrets?" "I haven't been smiling." The truth, flat and final. Mabel couldn't remember the last time she'd smiled about anything. "Don't lie to me!" His hand closed around her throat, squeezing just enough to make breathing difficult, but not impossible. This was a refined technique, something he'd practiced, the art of hurting without leaving marks people could see. "Eddie saw you talking with him, laughing. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know what that means?" "It means nothing." She forced the words past the pressure on her windpipe. "He fixed the stove flue. I said thank you. That's all." Thank you. Royce's laugh was ugly, broken. My wife saying thank you to another man for doing things her husband should be doing. You know how that makes me look? You know what the boys in town say about me? I don't care what they say. The honesty surprised them both. Royce's grip loosened slightly, his eyes widening with something that might have been hurt if he were capable of feelings that complex. You don't care. Jesus Christ, Mabel, when did you stop caring? When you started hitting me. She met his gaze dead on, too tired to be afraid anymore. When you started treating me like property instead of a person. When you stopped being my husband and started being my jailer. He released her then, stumbling backward like she'd shoved him. For a moment, just a flicker, Mabel saw something human in his face. Confusion, maybe. Or the ghost of the man he might have been if circumstances had been different. Then the moment passed, and the familiar mask of rage slid back into place. You want out? His voice dropped low, dangerous. That what this is about? You and Merrick planning something? Gonna run off together? Play house while I'm the laughingstock of the territory? I'm not planning anything with anyone. Exhaustion made her reckless. I'm just trying to survive you, Royce. That's it. That's all I've been doing for 3 years, surviving. Well, congratulations. He grabbed his coat from the peg by the door, weaving slightly. You survived another night. But you keep making eyes at that foreman. You keep making me look like a fool, and I'll make sure the next night's your last. You understand me? You're mine, Mabel. Mine. And I'll see you dead before I let another man have you. He slammed out into the darkness, leaving Mabel alone with her racing heart and the hot sting of tears she refused to shed. The threat wasn't empty. She knew that with the certainty of experience. Royce had killed before, back in Kansas, though he'd claimed self-defense and the law had believed him. Men always believed other men, especially when the dead couldn't tell their side. She touched her throat where his fingers had pressed, feeling the tender spots that would bloom into fingerprint bruises by morning. Tomorrow she'd wear her collar high and keep her face blank, and nobody would ask because nobody wanted to know. That was the bargain women like her made with the world. Silence in exchange for survival, invisibility in exchange for existence. But something had changed. Some fundamental calculus had shifted the night Colt spoke about his mother, about choices, about worth. Mabel looked around the shack's single room, at the broken table, the sagging bed, the walls that leaked cold and offered no shelter from the real weather of her life, and felt something hardening in her chest. Not hope, exactly. More like resolve. The kind of desperate, dangerous resolve that came when a person realized they'd already lost everything that mattered, so what the hell was left to fear? The next morning, she walked to the cookhouse before dawn with her collar buttoned tight and her sleeves pulled low. The routine should have been comforting: flour and fire, biscuits and coffee, the familiar choreography of feeding hungry men. But her hands shook worse than usual, and twice she caught herself staring out the window toward the settlement, expecting to see Royce coming with murder in his eyes. Colt found her during the mid-morning lull, when the hands had scattered and the cookhouse belonged to her alone. He didn't announce himself, just appeared in the doorway like a solidifying shadow, and Mabel's heart kicked into a gallop before she registered who it was. Didn't mean to startle you. He stayed on the threshold, respectful of boundaries she hadn't known she'd drawn. Got a minute? I've got 15 before I need to start lunch prep. He nodded, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. The gesture felt significant somehow, like drawing curtains or locking gates. I want to tell you something, and I want you to just listen. Don't argue, don't explain, just hear me. Can you do that? Mabel dried her hands on her apron, anxiety crawling up her spine. All right. I know what he did last night. Colt's voice stayed level, controlled, but something fierce burned behind his eyes. I know, because I was riding back from checking the water station near your shack, and I heard him shouting, heard things breaking, heard you telling him to stop. Her face went hot with shame. You shouldn't have. I said listen. Not harsh, but firm enough to make her mouth snap shut. I didn't go in because I figured you'd hate me for it, figured it would make things worse for you. But I stood there in the dark for 20 minutes, Mabel. 20 minutes, waiting to hear if I needed to kick that door down and pull him off you. You know what that felt like? Being close enough to help, but too far away to matter. I never asked you to protect me. I know, that's the problem. He moved closer, and Mabel forced herself to hold ground, even though every instinct screamed to retreat. You spent so long not asking for help that you forgot help's supposed to come without asking. That's what decent people do. They see someone drowning and they throw a rope. They don't stand on shore waiting for permission. And if the drowning person doesn't want the rope? Her voice came out smaller than intended. If they're so tired they'd rather just sink? Then I'd jump in anyway. Simple. Final. I'd jump in and drag you to shore kicking and screaming if I had to, because that's what you do for people who matter. The words hit like a physical blow, stealing breath and balance both. Mabel gripped the edge of the work table, knuckles white with pressure. You don't even know me. How can I matter? Don't need to know every detail of a person's life to know they deserve better than fists and fear. Colt closed the remaining distance between them, and his hand came up to brush her collar aside, exposing the purple-black fingerprint circling her throat like a necklace of shame. This is what I know. I know you show up every morning even when walking hurts. I know you cook with broken bones and never complain. I know you're brave as hell and twice as stubborn, and you're so goddamn convinced you're worthless that you can't see what's plain as day to everyone else. Which is? She barely whispered it. That you're extraordinary. That you deserve safety and kindness and a life that doesn't leave bruises. His thumb traced the edge of one mark with heartbreaking gentleness. That watching you suffer is killing me by inches, and I'm done pretending I can stand aside and let it happen. Mabel pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself like that could hold the breaking pieces together. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm going to Royce today. I'm going to tell him he puts hands on you again. I'll make sure he regrets it. No! The word came out sharp with panic. Colt, no! You can't. He'll kill you, or he'll kill me, or let him try. The same quiet certainty she'd heard before, the kind that came from men who'd already made their peace with consequences. I'm not my father, Mabel. I'm not going to stand by and watch another woman get beaten to death by a coward who thinks marriage gives him ownership. Not again. Never again. Please. She grabbed his arm, desperate now. Please don't do this. I'll leave. I'll take your offer and stay here at the ranch. I'll hide. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't confront him. Men like Royce, they don't back down. They double down. And if you back him into a corner, someone's going to die. Colt looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face, seeing too much as always. You'd really leave him? Come work here permanent. Let me keep you safe. The question hung heavy with implications Mabel couldn't untangle. If it means you don't get yourself killed over me, yes. Then we're agreed. He covered her hand with his, warm and calloused and steady. You move your things here today, tonight. We'll figure out the rest as it comes, but you're done sleeping under that bastard's roof. Done waiting for the night he decides breaking bones isn't enough. He won't let me go. The truth, bitter as poison. You don't understand. He'll come here. He'll make a scene, get me fired, drag me back by my hair if he has to. He told me, her voice cracked, he told me he'd see me dead before he'd let another man have me. Then he'll have to go through me first. Colt squeezed her hand once, then released it, stepping back to give her breathing room. I'm not some knight from a storybook, Mabel. I can't promise everything will be easy or clean, but I can promise this. As long as I'm breathing, Royce Danner doesn't touch you again. Not ever. That's a vow. He left before she could respond, striding out into the bright Montana morning like a man walking toward a fight he'd already won. And Mabel stood in her cookhouse kingdom, surrounded by flour and fire, and the smell of bread rising, feeling terror and something else warring in her chest. Something that felt dangerously, impossibly like hope. The decision made itself, really. By lunch, Mabel had packed her few possessions, 2 dresses, a comb, the photograph of her mother she'd managed to keep hidden from Royce's drunken rages, into a flour sack. The ranch foreman's quarters had a small back room, unused and dusty, that Colt offered without ceremony or expectation. It had a cot, a window, and a door that locked from the inside. Luxury beyond measure. She moved in during the afternoon lull while the hands were scattered across the range and Royce was presumably sleeping off last night's whiskey. Nobody commented. Nobody asked questions. The cowboys of the Lazy M had seen enough, heard enough to understand what was happening without needing it spelled out in polite words. A woman was choosing survival over marriage, safety over vows. And if that made her a scandal, well, the Montana Territory had seen worse. By evening, Mabel had a room of her own for the first time in 3 years. She locked the door, sat on the narrow cot, and cried with her face pressed into her knees so nobody would hear. Cried for the girl who'd thought marriage meant security. Cried for the woman who'd learned marriage could mean prison. Cried for all the days and nights she'd spent convincing herself this was normal, this was deserved, this was simply the cost of existing as female in a world run by men. When the tears finally stopped, she washed her face in the basin Colt had left on the small table, then went to make supper. The cookhouse felt different now, not a workplace she'd returned from to worse, but a space that was genuinely hers. Her kingdom, her domain, her small square of earth where she called the shots, and nobody raised a hand except to pass plates or pour coffee. Colt didn't join the hands for supper that night. Mabel told herself she wasn't disappointed, wasn't worried, wasn't imagining him confronting Royce in some dark alley with fists, or worse. She served beef stew and cornbread, kept the coffee coming, and ignored the knowing looks the cowboys shot her way. They knew. Of course they knew. In a territory this empty, secrets lasted about as long as snow in July. It was full dark when Colt finally appeared, slipping into the cookhouse through the back door like a thief. His knuckles were scraped raw and already swelling, his lips split and seeping blood. But his eyes held something Mabel had never seen there before: satisfaction. The grim pleasure of a man who'd done hard work and done it right. "What did you do?" She grabbed a clean cloth, wetting it from the water bucket. "Sit down. Let me see." "I'm fine." "The hell you are. Sit." He sat, obedient as a scolded dog, and Mabel began cleaning the blood from his face with hands that shook only slightly. The split lip wasn't bad, just messy the way face wounds always were. His knuckles looked worse, torn skin over bruised bone, the signature of a man who'd made hard contact with something solid. Royce's jaw, I'm guessing. She kept her voice light, clinical, because if she let herself feel what she was feeling, she'd shatter into 1,000 pieces that couldn't be reassembled. Among other things, Colt hissed when she pressed too hard. "Caught him outside Moe's saloon, drunk already at 6 o'clock. Told him you were done with him, done sleeping in that shack, done pretending marriage gave him the right to use you as a punching bag. And he took that well?" Sarcasm, bitter and brittle. "He took a swing at me, which I expected. So I put him down in the dirt and explained real clear that if he came near you again, I'd break both his legs and leave him for the coyotes. Then I hauled him to the sheriff's office and filed a complaint." Mabel's hands stilled. "You what?" "Filed a complaint. Told Sheriff Hodges that Royce had been beating you, that you'd left him for your own safety, and that any attempt to force you back should be treated as assault." Colt met her stunned gaze steadily. "Hodges wasn't happy about it, said domestic matters aren't usually law matters, but I made it clear that if he didn't take it seriously, I'd make sure the territorial marshal heard about a sheriff who ignored violence against women." "They'll never take your side over his." Despair hollowed out her voice. "I'm his wife. Legally, I'm his property. No court, no sheriff, no law will protect me from him." "Maybe not." Colt caught her hand, stopping her anxious cleaning. "But they'll know I'm watching. They'll know someone's keeping score. And that's more than you had yesterday." He was right. It was more. Not enough. Maybe never enough. But more. Mabel sank onto the bench beside him, exhausted down to her bones. "He's going to come. You know that, right? He's going to come here, probably drunk, definitely angry, and he's going to try to take me back or hurt you. Men like Royce, they don't accept defeat. They just get meaner. Then let him come." Colt's hand tightened on hers, warm and solid and utterly unafraid. "I'll be ready." Outside, the Montana night pressed close, stars scattered like salt across black velvet. Somewhere in that darkness, Royce Danner nursed his wounds and his rage, plotting revenge or surrender or something in between. And inside the cookhouse, two people who'd spent too long accepting cruelty as inevitable sat together in lamplight, holding hands and preparing for the storm they'd both seen gathering since the day a broken door got fixed and impossible words got spoken. The storm was coming, but for the first time in 3 years, Mabel Crowley wouldn't face it alone. 3 days passed like held breath, tense and waiting. Mabel moved through her cookhouse routines with one ear always tuned to the world beyond the walls, listening for the sound of boots she'd recognize anywhere. Royce's uneven gait, heavy on the left where he'd broken his ankle years ago, and it had healed crooked. The cowboys noticed her jumpiness, but said nothing, just positioned themselves a little closer during meals, lingered a little longer after supper. Silent guardians who'd decided, without discussion, that this woman under their roof deserved protecting. Colt became a constant presence, though he tried to make it look casual. He'd work within sight of the cookhouse, mending tack he'd already mended, checking horses that didn't need checking. At night, he slept in the front room of the foreman's quarters with his gun belt hanging on the bedpost and one eye metaphorically open. Mabel heard him moving around in the small hours, pacing like a caged animal, and knew he was listening too. On the 4th morning, Royce finally came. Mabel was kneading bread dough when she heard the commotion outside. Raised voices, the nervous whinny of horses, boots on hard-packed earth moving fast. Her hands froze in the flour, heart hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape. Through the window, she saw him staggering into the ranch yard, clothes filthy and breath visible in the cold dawn air, shouting her name like a curse. "Mabel, get your ass out here! Now!" The hands scattered like quail, not from cowardice, but from the kind of wisdom that comes from knowing when a situation's about to turn deadly. Only Colt held his ground, stepping out of the barn with that deliberate, unhurried stride that meant trouble. "Danner," his voice carried across the yard, flat and final as a judge's gavel. "You need to leave." "The hell I do?" Royce lurched toward him, and even from 30 feet away, Mabel could smell the whiskey rolling off him in waves. "That's my wife in there, my property, and I'm taking her home." "She's not your property, and she's not going anywhere with you." Colt positioned himself between Royce and the cookhouse, hands loose at his sides but ready. "You got a complaint, you take it to the sheriff. But you don't come onto this ranch making demands." "Sheriff," Royce spat the word like poison. "That son of a bitch told me there's nothing he can do. Said she left of her own free will. Said I can't force her back. Since when does a man need permission to retrieve his own wife?" "Since the law decided beating women wasn't a right that came with marriage." Colt's voice dropped lower. "Dangerous. Now you can leave walking, or you can leave bleeding. Your choice." Inside the cookhouse, Mabel watched with her heart in her throat, knowing this moment had been inevitable since the day she'd packed her flour sack and claimed the room with the locking door. Men like Royce didn't let go. They held on until something broke. The woman, the man defending her, or the man himself. She'd seen it before, back in Ohio, when Sarah Miller had tried to leave her husband and ended up in a pine box instead. Royce's hand dropped to his hip, and Mabel's blood went cold. He was wearing his gun, the old Army Colt he'd carried since Kansas and used once before when someone had questioned his honor. She opened her mouth to scream a warning, but Colt was already moving, crossing the space between them in 3 long strides, and catching Royce's wrist before the revolver cleared leather. What followed wasn't a fight so much as a demolition. Colt twisted Royce's arm behind his back with clinical efficiency, forced him to his knees in the dirt, and removed the gun with one hand while keeping pressure on with the other. Royce howled like a wounded animal, all rage and no sense, thrashing uselessly against the iron grip holding him down. "You broke my arm! You son of a bitch! You broke my arm!" "It's not broken. Yet." Colt shoved him flat, grinding his face into the dust. "But you make one more move toward that cookhouse, toward Mabel, toward anyone on this ranch, and I will break every bone in your miserable body. That clear enough for you?" "She's my wife." The words came out muffled, desperate. 3 years I kept her fed and clothed. 3 years she's been under my roof. You can't just steal a man's wife." "I didn't steal anything. She left." Big difference. Colt hauled Royce upright by his collar, holding him at arm's length, like something distasteful. "And she left because you treated her worse than you'd treat a dog. Because you used your fists when words didn't work and your boots when fists weren't enough. Because you're a drunk and a coward who only feels big when he's hurting someone smaller." Royce's face had gone red, then purple, veins standing out on his forehead like ropes. You're fucking her. That's what this is. You want her for yourself, so you fill her head with lies about deserving better, about being worth something. But I know the truth. She's nothing. She was nothing when I married her, and she's nothing now, and you're a fool if you think— Colt hit him. Not with rage, not with loss of control, but with the cold precision of a man who'd calculated exactly how much force was needed to shut someone up without killing them. Royce went down hard, blood exploding from his nose in a crimson spray that painted the dirt. He lay there wheezing and spitting, and when he finally looked up, his eyes held something Mabel had never seen in them before. Fear. You touch her again, Colt said quietly, and I'll kill you. Not threaten, not warn, just kill. And I'll sleep fine afterward, because the world's got no shortage of men, but it's damn short on women brave enough to survive bastards like you. He dropped Royce's gun in the water trough, where it hit with a splash and sank. Now get off this ranch before I change my mind and finish what you started. Royce scrambled to his feet, clutching his bleeding nose, and Mabel saw the exact moment he broke. Not his body, that was already broken, would probably carry these new injuries the rest of his sorry life. But something inside, some last shred of pride or delusion that had kept him standing, finally shattered. He looked toward the cookhouse where Mabel stood frozen in the window, and what passed between them wasn't love or even hate, just the cold recognition that something was over, finished, dead as last year's grass. You'll regret this, Royce said, but there was no heat in it, just empty words from an empty man. Both of you, mark my words. He staggered away toward the settlement, listing like a ship taking water, and nobody moved until he disappeared over the rise. Then the cowboys who'd been watching from strategic cover emerged, muttering among themselves, and Colt turned toward the cookhouse with shoulders that finally relaxed from their combat-ready tension. Mabel met him at the door, her whole body shaking so hard her teeth chattered. You shouldn't have— He could have shot you. If he'd gotten that gun out— He didn't. Colt's hands came up to her shoulders, steadying her. And he won't get another chance. That's done, Mabel. Whatever hold he had, it's broken now. You don't know that. She gripped his forearms, desperate for him to understand. You don't know men like him. They fester. They plot. They wait until you stop watching, and then they come back twice as mean. My father had a horse once that got beaten too much, and it seemed broken, seemed tame, right up until it kicked him in the head and damn near killed him. Royce is that horse. Then we'll keep watching. Simple. Final. Like everything with Colt, no elaborate promises, no flowery words, just solid certainty that felt more real than anything Mabel had known in years. I'm not asking you to trust that he's changed, or that he'll give up. I'm just asking you to trust that I won't let him hurt you again. Can you do that? Could she? Trust was a luxury she'd stopped affording herself around the time Royce's fists had started flying. Trust meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain, and pain meant— But looking up into Colt's gray eyes, seeing the scraped knuckles and the set of his jaw and the absolute conviction in his expression, Mabel found herself nodding. I can try. That's enough. He released her shoulders, stepping back to respectful distance, even though something in his face suggested he wanted to pull her close instead. Breakfast is late and the boys are probably starving. Think you can manage, or you need a minute? The question was kind, but Mabel recognized it for what it was. A chance to reclaim normalcy, to prove to herself and everyone watching that she wasn't broken beyond function. She straightened her spine, wiped flour dust from her apron, and managed something that might have passed for a smile if viewed from the right angle. I can manage. Biscuits in 20 minutes, tell them. She turned back to her dough, and Colt headed out to spread the word. And life on the Lazy M lurched back into motion like a wagon with a replaced wheel, moving forward, but everyone aware that something fundamental had shifted. By the time breakfast was served, the story had already taken shape in the cowboys' retelling. Colt Merrick had faced down Royce Danner and sent him packing, and Mabel Crowley had finally escaped the bastard who'd been using her for a punching bag. It was simplified, missing the complexity and terror and desperate hope that had actually characterized the morning, but sometimes simple stories were what people needed to make sense of complicated truth. The days that followed unfolded with surreal normalcy. Mabel cooked, the hands worked, Colt ran the ranch with his usual steady competence. But underneath the routine, Everyone waited. Waited for Royce to come back with reinforcements, or the law, or violence. Waited for the other boot to drop, because in the Montana Territory, things rarely resolved clean and easy as a single confrontation in a ranch yard. Mabel waited most of all. She went through her days with nerves stretched piano wire tight, jumping at unexpected sounds, checking over her shoulder compulsively. At night, alone in her small room with the door locked and the window latched, she lay awake listening to the ranch settle around her, the creak of wood, the whisper of wind, the distant howl of coyotes hunting in the darkness. Sometimes she heard Colt moving in the front room, his footsteps a strangely comforting rhythm, and she wondered what kept him awake. Worry for her safety, memories of his mother, or just the weight of having taken a stand that made him responsible for whatever came next. On the 8th day after the confrontation, Sheriff Hodges rode out to the ranch just after lunch. He was a thick-bodied man gone soft in middle age, with a handlebar mustache that had been impressive once and now just looked tired. He hitched his horse outside the cookhouse and knocked, hat in hand, expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Danner, need a word, if you've got a moment." Mabel dried her hands and stepped outside, heart hammering. "Sheriff, your husband filed a complaint. Says Colt Merrick assaulted him, threatened to kill him, stole his property, meaning you, and turned the ranch hands against him. Says he wants you returned to your marital home and Merrick arrested for assault and kidnapping." Hodges shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Now, I know there's more to this story than what Royce is telling. Man's got a reputation for drinking and cards, and folks have been whispering about how you show up to town with bruises. But legally speaking, I'm his property." Mabel heard her voice come out flat, dead. "Legally speaking, he can beat me bloody every night, and as long as I'm alive come morning, that's his right as a husband." "That's not exactly, isn't it?" She met his eyes, challenging. "You know what he did to me, Sheriff. You've seen the bruises. Hell, half the territory has seen them. But you never once asked if I needed help. Never once suggested that maybe a man who treats his wife like a target shouldn't get to keep her. So don't stand here now pretending the law gives a damn about women like me." Hodges had the grace to look ashamed, at least. "You're right. I should have done more. Should have asked questions. But I'm asking now. Do you want to press charges against your husband for what he did to you? Because if you do, if you testify, that changes things. Won't be easy. Folks don't take kindly to wives turning on husbands, but it's possible." The offer hung in the air like smoke, tempting and dangerous. Mabel thought about standing in front of a judge, reciting a catalog of injuries and humiliations while Royce glared from across the room. Thought about the town watching, judging, deciding whether she deserved sympathy or scorn. Thought about how women who testified against their husbands were treated, like traitors, like liars, like whores who'd gotten above themselves. But she also thought about the room with the locking door, the mornings without fear, the simple, revolutionary act of existing without flinching. "Yes," she said. "I want to press charges." Hodges nodded slowly, pulling out a small notebook. "All right then, tell me everything, start to finish. And Mrs. Danner, this is going to get ugly before it gets better. You sure you're ready for that?" "I'm sure I'm tired of hiding." She folded her arms across her chest, armor against the vulnerability of what she was about to do. "And I'm sure that if I don't speak up now, I never will. So yes, Sheriff, I'm ready." She told him everything. 3 years of marriage compressed into 30 minutes of testimony. The drinking, the gambling, the escalating violence that had gone from slaps to punches to the night he'd nearly strangled her for the crime of existing. She showed him her wrist, still slightly misshapen where it had healed wrong. Unbuttoned her collar to display fading fingerprints on her throat. Spoke in flat clinical terms because emotion would have broken her, and she needed to stay standing until this was done. When she finished, Hodges had filled 6 pages with his cramped handwriting. He closed the notebook with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep and tired. "This is good, detailed. Should be enough to bring formal charges. But Mabel, can I call you Mabel? You need to understand what you're starting here. Once this goes to court, there's no taking it back. Your marriage is over, legally and publicly. Your reputation in this territory is going to take a beating." And Royce said, "Well, a man facing jail time for hitting his wife might do desperate things." "He's already desperate." She thought of his face in the ranch yard, purple with rage and humiliation. And I'd rather face him fighting for my freedom than spend the rest of my life waiting for the night he kills me. Fair enough. Hodges stood, tucking the notebook in his vest pocket. I'll file the complaint today, get a warrant issued. Judge Blackwood's in town this week for the circuit court, so we might be able to get a hearing as early as Friday. That fast enough for you? Friday. 4 days to prepare, to steel herself, to figure out how to stand in front of God and the territory and claim her right to exist without violence. 4 days until her life changed irrevocably, one way or another. Yes, Sheriff, that's fast enough. After Hodges left, Mabel walked back into the cookhouse on legs that felt borrowed, like they belonged to someone braver. She should have felt triumphant. She'd done the impossible, spoken the unspeakable, taken the first real step toward freedom. But what she felt instead was terrified, the kind of bone-deep existential terror that came from knowing you'd just set events in motion that couldn't be stopped or controlled, only survived. Colt found her an hour later, sitting on the back step with her knees drawn up and her face pressed to her arms. He didn't ask what was wrong. He'd probably seen Hodges arrive, drawn his own conclusions. Instead, he sat beside her in comfortable silence, the kind of presence that didn't demand words or explanations. I press charges, Mabel said finally, voice muffled, against Royce, for everything. Good. Is it? She lifted her head, looking at him with eyes that felt rubbed raw. Because I just ruined any chance of reconciliation, destroyed my marriage publicly, and probably painted a target on my back for every man in the territory who thinks wives should keep quiet. Your marriage was already ruined. You just made it official. Colt's shoulder brushed hers, solid and warm. And any man who thinks you should have kept quiet can take that opinion and shove it up his ass. You did the brave thing, Mabel, the right thing. Brave, she laughed, brittle and broken. I'm scared out of my mind. The hearing's Friday, and I have to stand up there and tell a room full of strangers what Royce did to me. Have to let them see the bruises and hear the details and watch them decide if I'm telling the truth or just a lying wife trying to escape her vows. They'll believe you, said with such certainty that Mabel almost believed it herself. How can you know that? Because I'll be sitting right there in that courtroom, and so will every hand from this ranch who's seen you flinch at loud noises and hide your arms. Because Doc Patterson will testify about the times he treated you for accidents that looked a lot like fists. Because the truth's on your side, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, truth wins. Mabel wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that justice existed beyond the pages of dime novels and Sunday sermons. But she'd lived too long in the real world, where men made the laws and enforced them and broke them when convenient, and women like her were footnotes in other people's stories. What if I lose? The question came out small, childlike. What if the judge decides marriage vows are sacred and I need to go back to Royce? Then you don't go. Simple as that. We'll figure something else out, send you to family out of state, get you work in another territory, something. But you're not going back to that shack, Mabel. Not while I'm breathing. You can't promise that. The law? Fuck the law. The profanity shocked her, coming from a man who rarely raised his voice or spoke harsh. I've watched the law fail women my whole life. Watched it fail my mother, watched it fail every battered wife who thought justice might save her. So if the law decides you belong to Royce Danner, then I'll break the law. Gladly. Proudly. Whatever it takes. The declaration should have scared her. It was vigilante talk, the kind of thing that got men hung or run out of territories. But instead, it felt like a blanket thrown over shaking shoulders, like someone finally saying the things she'd needed to hear for years, that she mattered more than rules, that her safety trumped tradition, that the world could burn before she'd be handed back to violence. Thank you, she whispered, for everything, for fighting him, for believing me, for... Her voice cracked, for making me believe I might be worth saving. Colt's hand found hers, rough with calluses and work, and held on like she was precious. You've always been worth saving. You just needed someone to remind you. They sat there as the afternoon light turned golden, two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and decided, against all odds and common sense, that maybe broken things could be mended, that maybe women who'd been beaten could learn to stand straight again, That maybe men who'd watched their mothers die could find redemption in protecting someone else's daughter, someone else's wife, someone else's woman who'd been told too many times she didn't matter. Inside the cookhouse, bread dough was rising. Outside, the Montana plains stretched forever. And somewhere in the settlement, Royce Danner was getting drunk and bitter, planning his response to a wife who'd finally stopped accepting his fists as fate. The storm they'd all been waiting for was about to break in full fury. But for this one suspended moment, Mabel let herself rest against Colt's shoulder and pretend she was already safe. The next 4 days passed in a blur of preparation and dread. Hodges returned with the warrant, and 2 deputies rode out to the settlement to arrest Royce on charges of assault and battery. He came quietly, or so the story went, though his eyes when they loaded him in the wagon promised retribution. The jail in Dust Creek wasn't much, 3 cells and a drunk tank, but it was enough to keep him contained until the hearing. Mabel practiced her testimony in the privacy of her small room, speaking to the walls what she'd soon have to speak publicly. Doc Patterson stopped by the ranch to examine her injuries officially, documenting everything with clinical precision that made her feel exposed but also validated. Finally, someone was taking this seriously as evidence rather than dismissing it as private business. And Colt drilled the ranch hands who'd witnessed various incidents, making sure their stories aligned not because they were lying, but because truth needed to be presented clearly to cut through the noise of tradition. The night before the hearing, Mabel couldn't sleep. She lay on her narrow cot watching moonlight paint silver squares on the floor and wondering if this time tomorrow she'd be free or trapped, vindicated or condemned. Around 2 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and wrapped herself in a blanket, padding barefoot to the front room where lamplight still glowed under Colt's door. She knocked softly. "You awake?" "Yeah." The door opened, revealing Colt, fully dressed, sitting at the small table with papers spread before him. Lists, notes, preparations. "Can't sleep either?" "Can't turn my brain off." She hesitated at the threshold, aware this was improper, that being alone with him at this hour in this place was the kind of thing that would destroy what remained of her reputation if anyone knew. But she was so tired of caring about reputation, about propriety, about all the rules that had never protected her from anything that actually mattered. "Come in." He gestured to the chair across from him. "I was just going over tomorrow's logistics. Hearing starts at 10, should last a few hours depending on how much testimony the judge allows. I've got 6 hands ready to speak if needed, plus Doc Patterson, plus Sheriff Hodges will present your formal complaint. It's solid, Mabel. Really solid. Unless Judge Blackwood decides none of it matters." She pulled the blanket tighter. "Unless he's one of those men who thinks wives are property and husbands can do as they please. Blackwood's fair, from what I've heard. Strict, but fair. And even if he weren't, we've got enough evidence to make ignoring it look like corruption." Colt's jaw tightened. "Either way, this ends tomorrow. One way or another, you get closure." Closure? Mabel tested the word, finding it strange and foreign. "I'm not sure I know what that looks like." "Looks like waking up without wondering if today's the day he kills you. Looks like walking into town with your head up. Looks like—" He paused, something shifting in his expression. "Looks like whatever you want it to look like. Your life. Your choices. Your future." "And if my future looks like staying here?" The question escaped before she could stop it, vulnerable and raw. "Would that be all right? Or do you, once this is over, once I'm legally free, do you want me to leave?" Colt stared at her like she'd spoken in tongues. "Leave? Jesus, Mabel, no! I want—" He stopped, started again. "I want you to stay. Want you to keep cooking for the ranch, keep living in that room, keep existing in a space where nobody hurts you. And maybe, if you wanted, if you were ready someday, I'd like to—" Another pause. This one waited with things unsaid. "To what?" Her heart hammered in her chest. "To court you proper." The admission came rough, like pulling splinters. Take you to church socials, buy you ribbons at the mercantile, sit on your porch, well, our porch, I guess, and talk about nothing important until your reputation's rebuilt and folks remember you're a person, not a scandal. And then, if you were agreeable, maybe ask if you'd consider marrying a broken-down foreman who's too old and too serious but thinks you're the finest thing he's ever had the privilege of knowing. Mabel couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at this man who'd fought for her, bled for her, risked everything for her, and was now offering not possession or expectation, but courtship, time, respect, a future built on choice instead of desperation. "I'm still married," she managed. "Technically, legally." "I know, that's why I said someday. After tomorrow, after the divorce is finalized, after you've had time to heal and figure out who you are without fear." He reached across the table, palm up, offering. "I'm not asking for an answer, Mabel. I'm just telling you my intentions so you know where I stand. So you know that when I fight for you tomorrow, it's not because I expect anything in return. It's because you deserve someone fighting for you. Period." She placed her hand in his, feeling calluses against calluses, damage against damage, survival against survival. "When this is over," she said slowly, "when I'm free and clear and have a moment to breathe, I'd like that. The courting, the porches. The future where I choose instead of endure. Then that's what you'll get." Colt squeezed gently, then released her, respectful even now of boundaries and propriety. "Should probably try to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long." "Yeah." But Mabel didn't move, didn't want to return to her room and her racing thoughts. "Colt, what if I'm not brave enough? What if I get up there in front of everyone and freeze? Then I'll testify instead. Tell them what I've seen, what I know." His gray eyes held hers, steady and sure. "You're not alone in this, Mabel. That's what I keep trying to make you understand. You don't have to be brave enough for everyone, just brave enough for yourself. The rest of us will cover the difference." This time, when she stood to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at him. This quiet, solid man who'd taken her broken situation and offered not pity but partnership. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me when I was invisible, for believing me when I was silent, for fighting when I was too tired to fight for myself." "Always," Colt replied, "for as long as you'll let me." She carried that promise back to her room like a candle flame cupped against wind, and somehow, impossibly, she slept. Morning came cold and clear, the kind of day where frost painted lace on windows and breath hung visible in still air. Mabel woke to the sound of cowboys moving through their routines, the comfortable noise of men who knew their work and did it without fuss. She dressed carefully in her best dress, dark blue calico that didn't show stains, high-necked and long-sleeved even though the bruises had faded to shadows. Armor, she thought. Protection against the eyes that would judge and dissect and decide if her pain had been real enough to matter. Colt was waiting outside with the wagon hitched, his face freshly shaved, and his expression grim but determined. 6 ranch hands sat on horseback behind him, dressed in their Sunday clothes such as they were, ready to ride into town and bear witness. The sight of them, rough men who owed her nothing but had decided she was worth defending, made Mabel's eyes sting with tears she couldn't afford to shed. Not yet. Not until this was over. The ride to Dust Creek took 45 minutes, and Mabel spent every one of them rehearsing testimony in her head, while trying not to vomit from sheer terror. Colt drove in silence, but his presence beside her was steady as bedrock, and twice his hand found hers where it gripped the wagon seat, squeezing reassurance without words. Behind them, the cowboys rode in formation like an honor guard, and Mabel wondered if they understood what they were risking, their reputations, their standing in a community that didn't take kindly to men who sided with wives against husbands, their very employment if this went sideways and the ranch owner decided protecting her wasn't worth the controversy. Dust Creek's courthouse was a 2-story timber building that also served as town hall, church on Sundays, and dance hall when the circuit preacher wasn't using it for revivals. By the time they arrived, a crowd had already gathered, curious townspeople drawn by gossip like flies to carrion, women whispering behind gloved hands, men standing in tight knots with expressions ranging from sympathy to hostility. Mabel felt their eyes like brands as Colt helped her down from the wagon, heard the hiss of her name passed from mouth to mouth like currency. There she is, Royce Danner's wife. Heard she's claiming he beat her. Can you imagine? Well, I always thought she looked poorly, too thin by half. My husband says it's none of our business what happens between a man and his wife. Your husband's a drunk who can't keep his hands to himself either, Ethel, so maybe he's got reason to worry. Sheriff Hodges met them at the courthouse steps, looking official in his pressed uniform and polished badge. "Mrs. Danner, Merrick, glad you're here early, gives us time to go over procedure. Judge Blackwood's a stickler for formality, so I need you to address him as Your Honor and answer only the questions asked. Don't elaborate unless he invites it. Understood?" Mabel nodded, though her throat had gone so dry she wasn't sure she could speak at all. Beside her, Colt's hand settled warm and grounding on the small of her back. Not possessive, just present, reminding her she wasn't alone even when it felt like the whole world was watching and waiting for her to break. They filed inside to a courtroom that smelled of old wood and lamp oil, with hard benches arranged in rows and a raised platform at the front where Judge Blackwood would preside. The crowd packed in behind them, filling seats and standing along the walls, and the noise of their murmuring grew to a dull roar that made Mabel's head pound. She took her place at the plaintiff's table with Sheriff Hodges, while across the narrow aisle, Royce sat with his attorney, a thin, sharp-faced man named Morris, who'd come up from Billings and had a reputation for getting guilty men acquitted on technicalities. Royce looked terrible. His nose sat crooked where Colt had broken it, both eyes were still blackened, and his right arm rested in a sling that might have been genuine injury or might have been theater. But his eyes were clear and cold and focused on Mabel with an intensity that made her skin crawl. This was the look she'd learned to fear, the one that came before violence, before words turned to fists and fists turned to worse. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to not look away or flinch, because backing down now would be the same as admitting she belonged to him still. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Silas Blackwood." Everyone stood as the judge entered, a tall man gone gray but still imposing, with a face carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. He took his seat, arranged his papers with precise movements, and surveyed the crowded courtroom with the expression of someone who'd seen every kind of human ugliness and had stopped being surprised by any of it. "Be seated. We're here today to address charges of assault and battery brought by Mrs. Mabel Danner against her husband, Mr. Royce Danner. This is a preliminary hearing to determine if sufficient evidence exists to warrant a full trial." His voice carried clear and cold through the room. "Sheriff Hodges, present your case." Hodges stood, opening the notebook he'd filled with Mabel's testimony. "Your Honor, on the morning of October 14th, Mrs. Danner came to my office and filed formal charges against her husband for repeated assault over the course of their 3-year marriage. She provided detailed testimony, physical evidence of injury, and witness corroboration. With the court's permission, I'd like to call Mrs. Danner to testify first, followed by supporting witnesses." Permission granted. Mrs. Danner approached the bench. Mabel stood on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, walked the 10 feet to the witness chair, and placed her hand on the Bible the clerk held out. Her palm was sweating so badly she left a print on the worn leather. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, and she took that as a good sign. Judge Blackwood studied her over his spectacles. "Mrs. Danner, I understand this is difficult, but I need you to tell this court, in your own words, why you've brought charges against your husband. Begin with the first incident you remember." The first incident. Mabel closed her eyes, reaching back through the years to a night 6 months into their marriage when Royce had come home drunk and angry and she'd made the mistake of asking where he'd been. The slap had shocked her more than hurt her, but the look in his eyes, cold satisfaction, like he'd discovered something about himself he'd been curious about, that had been the real injury. "It started small," she said, opening her eyes and fixing them on a spot just above Judge Blackwood's head. Easier than looking at faces, at Royce, at the crowd judging every word. A slap here and there when he'd been drinking, then shoving. Then he started using his fists when I said things he didn't like, or when he'd lost at cards and needed someone to blame. It got worse over time. The last 3 months especially, Her voice caught, and she had to swallow hard to continue. "He broke my wrist, choked me, told me he'd kill me before he'd let me leave." "These are serious accusations, Mrs. Danner. Do you have evidence to support them?" "Yes, Your Honor." She stood and began unbuttoning her collar with shaking fingers, exposing the faded but still visible bruises on her throat. Then her sleeves, rolling them back to show the misshapen wrist, the older scars from cuts and burns. The courtroom had gone silent. the kind of profound quiet that comes when people are confronted with something they'd rather not see. Doc Patterson examined me and wrote it all down, and there are witnesses. Ranch hands who saw me flinch, who noticed I couldn't work right, who heard Royce threatening me. Judge Blackwood's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been anger or might have been pity. Attorney Morris, does your client dispute these claims? Morris stood, all sharp angles and sharper words. My client acknowledges that he and his wife had disagreements, as all married couples do. However, he maintains that Mrs. Danner is exaggerating minor domestic disputes to justify abandoning her marital obligations. Furthermore, Your Honor, I'd like to remind the court that Mrs. Danner left the marital home and took up residence with Mr. Colt Merrick, the ranch foreman who is sitting in this courtroom right now. I believe the real motivation here isn't escaping abuse, but rather pursuing an adulterous relationship while destroying my client's reputation. The words hit like a physical blow. Mabel heard the gasps from the crowd, felt the shift in energy as people who'd been sympathetic suddenly reconsidered. Because this was what men like Morris did. They took a woman's truth and twisted it, made it about sex instead of survival, about wanting instead of needing. That's not true. Her voice came out too loud, almost shrill. I moved to the ranch because it was safe, because Mr. Merrick offered me a room with a door that locked and promised Royce couldn't hurt me there. Nothing inappropriate happened between us. Nothing. So you say, Morris replied smoothly. But the appearance of impropriety is often as damaging as the act itself, isn't it, Mrs. Danner? A married woman living under the same roof as an unmarried man, no matter how innocent the arrangement, invites speculation. And speculation is exactly what my client has had to endure while his wife plays the victim. Enough! Judge Blackwood's voice cracked like a whip. Mr. Morris, you'll have your chance to present a defense if this proceeds to trial. Right now, I'm concerned with determining if Mrs. Danner's injuries are consistent with her testimony. Sheriff, call your next witness. Doc Patterson took the stand next, a wizened man with gentle hands and sad eyes who'd been patching up Dust Creek's residents for 30 years. He testified to treating Mabel twice for injuries she'd claimed were accidents, a broken rib from falling downstairs and a deep cut on her arm from slipping with a knife, but that he'd suspected domestic violence both times. His medical examination from 3 days ago, he said, had revealed extensive bruising in various stages of healing consistent with repeated assault over time. In your professional opinion, doctor, could these injuries have been self-inflicted or accidental? Not a chance, Your Honor. The pattern and placement indicate someone else inflicted them. Someone bigger and stronger, using fists and possibly weapons. I've seen enough injuries in my time to know the difference between an accident and an assault. Then came the ranch hands, one after another, testifying to what they'd seen and heard. Jim Fowler, the youngest, described finding Mabel crying in the cookhouse with fresh bruises on her face. Tom Bradley told about the morning Royce had grabbed her in the ranch yard, how he'd squeezed her wrist until she'd gone pale with pain. Each testimony added weight to the scale, evidence piling up like stones until even the skeptics in the crowd started shifting uncomfortably. When Colt finally took the stand, Mabel felt her heart kick into a higher gear. This was dangerous territory. Morris would try to paint him as a homewrecker, a man whose interest in protecting her was really just lust dressed up as chivalry. And if people believed that, everything they'd built would crumble. Mr. Merrick, Judge Blackwood began, what is your relationship to Mrs. Danner? I'm the foreman at the Lazy M Ranch where she works as cook. I consider her a friend and someone under my protection. And what prompted you to offer her protection? Colt's jaw worked for a moment before he answered. I watched my mother die from the accumulated injuries of years of abuse by my father. Watched her get smaller and quieter and more broken until she just gave up living. When I saw Mrs. Danner showing the same signs, the flinching, the hiding, the fear that never quite left her eyes, I decided I wouldn't stand by silent. Not again. Noble sentiment, but Mr. Morris has implied your interest in Mrs. Danner might be less than pure. How do you respond to that? I respond by saying that men who beat their wives always try to make it about something else, about the woman wanting to leave or wanting another man or being hysterical. Anything except admitting they're cowards who only feel big when they're hurting someone smaller. Colt leaned forward, his voice dropping but somehow carrying more weight. I'm not perfect, Your Honor. I've made mistakes. But taking in a woman who is being beaten to death by her husband isn't one of them. That's called being human. And if the law says being human is wrong, then the law needs changing. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some approving, some outraged. Judge Blackwood banged his gavel twice, sharp reports that cut through the noise. Order, Mr. Merrick, you're excused. Mr. Morris, would you like to call any witnesses for the defense? Morris stood, and Mabel's stomach dropped. Just one, Your Honor. I call Royce Danner to the stand. Royce took the oath with his good hand on the Bible, his face a careful mask of wounded dignity. He looked nothing like the man who'd choked her in their shack, who'd threatened to kill her before letting her go. He looked like a victim, wronged, betrayed, suffering. Mr. Danner, Morris began, please tell the court your version of events. My wife and I had our problems, sure. What married couple doesn't? But I never beat her the way she's claiming. Maybe I raised my voice when I'd been drinking. Maybe I grabbed her arm too hard once or twice when we were arguing. But break her wrist? Choke her? Try to kill her? He shook his head, eyes wet with what looked like genuine tears. Never. I loved that woman. Still do. And to have her stand up here and lie about me, to drag my name through the mud because she's been seduced by a ranch foreman with more muscles than morals, it's killing me, Your Honor. Just killing me. And what do you say to the medical evidence, the documented injuries? I say Mabel's always been clumsy, falls a lot, drops things, walks into doors. Hell, I spent half our marriage worried she'd hurt herself when I wasn't around to help. His voice took on a wheedling tone that made Mabel's skin crawl. As for the injuries Doc Patterson found, who's to say she didn't get those after she left me? Who's to say Merrick didn't rough her up and tell her to blame me? Seems convenient, doesn't it, that she suddenly has all this evidence right when she decides to run off with another man? The lies were so smooth, so practiced, that Mabel almost believed them herself, almost forgot the reality of his fists, his rage, the terror that had been her constant companion. But then she looked at Colt sitting rigid in the gallery, looked at the ranch hands who'd testified truth, looked at her own scarred arms, and remembered. This was what abusers did. They lied. They performed. They convinced everyone they were the real victims while their wives bled. Mr. Danner, Judge Blackwood said slowly, you claim your wife is lying about the abuse, but you don't dispute the injuries exist. I dispute that I caused them, Your Honor. I see. And the altercation at the Lazy M Ranch, when Mr. Merrick physically subdued you and you subsequently filed a complaint, what was that about? Royce's face darkened. That was about a man taking another man's wife and then attacking him for trying to get her back. Merrick broke my nose, Your Honor. Damn near broke my arm. And he did it in front of witnesses while threatening to kill me if I came near Mabel again. If anyone's guilty of assault here, it's him. Interesting argument. So your position is that you're the injured party, not your wife? Yes, Your Honor, exactly. Judge Blackwood removed his spectacles and polished them slowly, his face unreadable. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for judgment that felt like it could tip either way. Mabel's hands twisted in her lap, nails digging crescents into her palms, and she sent up prayers to a God she'd stopped believing in years ago. Please let him see the truth. Please don't send me back to that shack, that life, that man who'd promised to kill me. I've heard enough, the judge finally said, replacing his spectacles. Mr. Danner, return to your seat. Mrs. Danner, remain where you are. I'm ready to make my ruling. The silence that fell was absolute, expectant. Even the crowd outside pushing against the windows seemed to hold still, waiting. This court has heard testimony from multiple witnesses corroborating Mrs. Danner's claims of sustained abuse. We have medical evidence consistent with repeated assault. We have a pattern of behavior that suggests escalating violence over time. Against this, we have Mr. Danner's denial and his attorney's attempt to impugn Mrs. Danner's character by suggesting an improper relationship with Mr. Merrick. Judge Blackwood paused, letting his gaze sweep the courtroom. I find the evidence presented by Mrs. Danner to be credible and sufficient. Therefore, I am issuing a judicial separation, effective immediately. Mrs. Danner is released from the obligation to cohabit with her husband and may reside where she chooses without fear of legal repercussion. Gasps and murmurs filled the room, but the judge wasn't finished. His gavel came down hard, demanding silence. Furthermore, I am granting Mrs. Danner's petition for divorce on grounds of cruelty and placing a restraining order on Mr. Danner. He is not to approach within 100 yards of Mrs. Danner or the Lazy M Ranch, under penalty of immediate arrest. The divorce will be finalized in 6 months, as per territorial law. Your Honor, I object. Morris shot to his feet. This is highly irregular. Marriage is a contract, Mr. Morris, and like all contracts, it can be dissolved when one party breaches the terms through violence. Your objection is noted and overruled. Blackwood's eyes found Royce, who sat frozen with shock and rage warring on his face. Mr. Danner, I'm also fining you $50 for assault and sentencing you to 30 days in jail, time served to be credited. You'll be released in 3 weeks, at which point you'll leave Dust Creek and not return while Mrs. Danner resides here. If you violate any part of this order, I'll extend your sentence and increase the fine. Am I understood? Royce's mouth worked, but no sound came out. Morris leaned close to whisper urgently, and finally Royce managed a strangled, "Yes, Your Honor." Good. As for you, Mr. Merrick, the judge's attention swung to Colt, and Mabel's heart stopped. I understand your protective instincts, and I commend your willingness to help someone in need. But vigilante justice is still justice taken into private hands, which this court cannot condone. Consider yourself warned. Any further physical altercation with Mr. Danner, and I'll charge you with assault regardless of provocation. Clear? Yes, Your Honor. Colt's voice was steady, accepting. Then we're done here. Mrs. Danner, you're free to go. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down with final authority, and suddenly the room exploded into noise, people talking, arguing, rushing toward Mabel with questions or congratulations or condemnation, but she couldn't hear any of it over the roaring in her ears, couldn't feel anything except the dizzy, disorienting sense of weightlessness that came from having chains broken after years of wearing them. She was free. Legally, officially, free. Colt appeared at her elbow, solid and grounding, guiding her through the crowd toward the door. The ranch hands formed a protective cordon around them, keeping the curious and the hostile at bay, and together they made it outside into air that tasted impossibly sweet. Mabel stood on the courthouse steps, gulping oxygen like a drowning woman surfacing, and when her knees finally buckled, Colt caught her before she could fall. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe now. You're safe." She clung to him shamelessly, past caring what anyone thought, and let herself shake apart in his arms. Let herself feel everything she'd been holding back for 3 years, the fear, the rage, the grief for the woman she'd been before Royce had taught her to be small and quiet and invisible. Tears came hot and fast, soaking into Colt's shirt, and he just held her through it all, steady as sunrise. Around them, the ranch hands kept watch. Jim Fowler held the wagon horses. Tom Bradley stood with arms crossed, daring anyone to approach. And Sheriff Hodges hovered nearby, looking relieved and tired, and maybe a little proud. "Mrs. Danner," he said softly when her tears finally slowed. "I'm sorry I didn't act sooner. Should have listened when folks were talking, should have asked you direct what was happening, but I'm glad you found the courage to speak up. You did good today, real good." "Thank you, Sheriff." Her voice came out raw, scraped clean. "For believing me, for helping. Just doing what should have been done years ago." He tipped his hat. "You need anything, you let me know. In the meantime, Royce stays locked up until his sentence is served, and then he's got 3 days to clear out of the territory. You won't have to see him again if you don't want to." 3 weeks. Mabel would have 3 weeks of knowing exactly where Royce was, of not jumping at shadows or waiting for his fists to find her. 3 weeks to start believing safety wasn't temporary, and then he'd be gone, banished by law instead of luck, and she'd have the rest of her life to figure out who she was when she wasn't busy surviving. The ride back to the ranch passed in a blur of exhaustion and relief. Mabel dozed against Colt's shoulder, lulled by the wagon's rhythm and the bone-deep weariness that came after crisis. When they finally pulled into the ranch yard, the sun was setting in bands of copper and gold, painting the world in colors that looked like hope. "You should rest," Colt said, helping her down. "I'll handle supper tonight. The boys can make do with beans and bacon." "You should rest," he repeated, firmer now, You just fought the hardest battle of your life and won. That deserves recovery time. She wanted to argue, but her body was already making the decision for her, moving toward the foreman's quarters and the small room that had become sanctuary. Inside, she collapsed onto the cot, still wearing her court dress, too tired to even undress properly. Sleep took her fast and deep, the kind of dreamless dark that came when the mind finally felt safe enough to truly let go. She woke hours later to lamplight under her door and the smell of coffee. For a moment, she lay disoriented, unsure if the day had been real or just an elaborate dream. Then memory returned. Judge Blackwood's gavel, Royce's face when he'd realized he'd lost, Colt's arms catching her when she'd fallen. And with it came the stunning, impossible truth. She was free. Mabel rose, smoothed her dress, and padded into the front room where Colt sat at the table with 2 cups of coffee waiting. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression, warmth, pride, tenderness, made her chest tighten. "Thought you might wake up thirsty." He pushed 1 cup toward her. "It's not fancy, but it's hot." She sat, wrapping both hands around the cup and letting the heat seep into her palms. "Thank you for everything, for fighting, for testifying, for—" Her voice caught. "For making me believe I could win." "You made yourself believe that," Colt corrected gently. "I just reminded you of what was already there. The strength, the courage, the stubborn refusal to accept cruelty as normal. That was all you, Mabel." It didn't feel like me. It felt like someone braver, someone who deserved saving. Same person. He took a sip of his coffee, watching her over the rim. "You just couldn't see it because you'd been told for so long you were worthless. But now? Now you got legal proof you matter. A judge looked at the evidence and decided you were worth protecting. That's got to count for something." It counted for everything. Mabel drank her coffee in silence, feeling pieces of herself that had been scattered for years slowly gathering back together. The woman who'd wanted things before learning want led to pain. The girl who'd believed in kindness before experience taught her cruelty was more common. The person she might become now that survival wasn't her only goal. "What happens next?" she asked finally. "Do I just go back to cooking? Pretend everything's normal?" "You do whatever feels right. If that's cooking, then cook. If it's taking a few days to breathe and figure things out, then do that. There's no script for this, Mabel. You get to write your own now." Write her own. The concept felt foreign and thrilling and terrifying all at once. For 3 years, Royce had written her story. When she woke, where she went, what she was allowed to feel and say and want. And before that, poverty and circumstance had written it, limiting her choices to survival or surrender. But now, with divorce pending and safety secured, the pages ahead were blank, hers to fill however she chose. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to stay. Keep cooking for the ranch. Live in this room until I figure out what comes after. Maybe learn to be alone without being lonely, if that makes sense." Makes perfect sense. Colt's hand found hers across the table, that same gentle grip that had steadied her through everything. "And when you're ready, whenever that is, I'll still be here. Still hoping you might consider that courting I mentioned. But no pressure, no expectations, just possibility. Possibility." Mabel turned the word over in her mind, finding it strange and wonderful. Possibility that she might love again without fearing fists. Possibility that mornings could be gentle instead of terrifying. Possibility that she was worth more than breaking, worth the trouble of healing, worth a future that didn't require her to be small or silent or invisible. "I'd like that," she whispered. The possibility. All of it. Outside, the Montana night pressed close with its 1,000 stars and endless sky. Inside, 2 damaged people sat together over coffee, making quiet plans for futures they'd earned through courage and stubbornness and the radical belief that sometimes, if you fought hard enough and refused to accept cruelty as fate, broken things could actually mend. The storm had passed. What remained was the slow, patient work of rebuilding. The weeks that followed the hearing moved with the strange, dreamlike quality of life after catastrophe. Everything familiar but fundamentally altered, like looking at the world through glass that had cracked and been repaired but would never be quite the same. Mabel returned to her cookhouse routines with something approaching normalcy, rising before dawn to light the stove, kneading dough with hands that no longer shook quite so badly, feeding hungry cowboys who treated her with a new gentleness that was both touching and slightly uncomfortable. They'd seen her break open in that courtroom, watched her bleed truth in front of God and the territory, and it had changed how they looked at her. Not with pity, exactly, but with the kind of respect reserved for soldiers who'd survived battles others only heard about. Royce remained locked in the Dust Creek jail for those 3 weeks, a fact Sheriff Hodges confirmed weekly when he rode out to the ranch on official business that felt more like checking on Mabel than anything else. Each visit brought the same report. Royce was sullen, angry, but contained. No visitors except his attorney. No outbursts. Just a man serving his time and, presumably, nursing his hatred. The restraining order and impending banishment hung over him like a noose, and everyone in the territory knew that if he violated either, Judge Blackwood would make the consequences severe enough to serve as example. But knowing where Royce was didn't entirely erase the fear. Mabel still woke sometimes in the night, heart pounding, convinced she'd heard his uneven footsteps outside her door. Still flinched at loud noises, still caught herself checking over her shoulder compulsively, waiting for him to materialize like a bad dream that refused to end. The body remembered trauma even when the mind tried to move past it, and healing turned out to be less a straight line than a jagged path full of backsliding and false starts. Colt understood without her having to explain. He'd lived through his own version of this with his mother, watched her jump at shadows long after his father was gone, and so he knew better than to rush Mabel's recovery or expect gratitude to translate immediately into trust. Instead, he gave her space and time, maintaining a respectful distance during the day while making sure she was never truly alone. He worked within sight of the cookhouse, took his meals with the hands but lingered after to help with dishes, walked her to her room each night and waited outside until he heard the lock click home. Protection without possession, care without claim. 2 weeks after the hearing, on a crystalline morning when frost painted the world silver, Mabel finally worked up the courage to return to the shack she'd shared with Royce. She needed to collect the few possessions she'd left behind. Her mother's photograph, a quilt her grandmother had sewn, the wedding ring she'd worn for 3 years and didn't want anymore but felt wrong abandoning. Colt offered to come with her, and this time Mabel accepted without argument. Some places held too many ghosts to face alone. The shack looked smaller than she remembered, meaner, like it had shrunk in her absence, or maybe she'd simply grown too large for the space that had contained her. The door hung crooked. Royce had never fixed it after kicking it off its hinges one drunken night. And inside, the single room was chaos. Clothes strewn everywhere, dishes piled filthy in the basin, the smell of old whiskey and older anger permeating everything. This was where she'd lived, where she'd cowered and bled and convinced herself there was no escape. Jesus, Colt muttered, taking in the wreckage. How did you survive this? By pretending I was somewhere else. Mabel moved through the room mechanically, gathering her things with hands that wanted to shake but refused to let them. By making myself small enough that maybe he'd forget I was here. By counting minutes until I could leave for the cookhouse where things made sense. She found the photograph tucked under the sagging mattress where she'd hidden it to keep Royce from using it for target practice or worse. Her mother's face looked out at her, young and hopeful in a way Mabel couldn't quite remember being, and she pressed it to her chest like a talisman. The quilt was harder to locate. Royce had apparently been using it as a dog bed for a stray that had wandered off or died. But she shook it out, decided it could be washed, and added it to her small pile. The wedding ring sat on the table, tarnished and accusatory. Mabel picked it up, feeling the weight of 3 years in a circle of cheap silver, and walked outside where Colt was checking the perimeter like he expected Royce to materialize from the sagebrush. She held the ring out to him, and he looked at it with an expression she couldn't quite read. What do you want me to do with it? Throw it away. Bury it. I don't care. I just don't want to carry it anymore. She dropped it into his palm, and the relief that came from releasing that final symbol was so profound she felt lightheaded. It never meant anything good, just a chain I wore because I thought I had to. Colt closed his fist around the ring, then walked to the well and dropped it in. The splash echoed up from the darkness below, final and complete. Gone, he said simply. Can't hurt you now. They burned the shack that afternoon. Not out of spite or revenge, but because Mabel asked, and because Colt understood that some places needed destroying to keep their ghosts from following you home. The dry timber went up fast, flames crackling orange against blue sky, smoke rising in a column that could probably be seen from town. Nobody came to investigate. Nobody cared. Royce Danner's shack burning to ash was probably seen as a public service, one less eyesore on the edge of a settlement trying to convince itself it was civilized. Mabel watched it burn with Colt's hand warm in hers, and when the roof finally collapsed in a shower of sparks, she felt something inside her collapse too. Not breaking, but releasing. Letting go of the woman she'd been in that place, the fear that had lived in her bones, the belief that this was all she deserved. The fire consumed it all, reducing 3 years of suffering to smoke and ash that the wind scattered across the plains like it had never been. "Feel better?" Colt asked as they rode back to the ranch. "I feel lighter," Mabel said, testing the truth of it. "Like I've been carrying something heavy for so long I forgot what it felt like to stand up straight. Does that make sense?" Perfect sense. He glanced at her, and in the afternoon light his eyes looked less like winter clouds and more like clear sky. "You're allowed to let it go, you know. The hurt, the anger, all of it. Keeping it doesn't make you stronger, it just makes you tired." "I don't know how to let it go," she admitted. "Every time I think I'm past it, something reminds me, a raised voice, a door slamming, and I'm right back there, waiting for his fists." That's normal. Healing isn't forgetting. It's learning to remember without letting the memory own you. He was quiet for a moment, the wagon creaking beneath them. "My mother never got the chance to heal. She died still flinching, still afraid, still believing my father's lies that she deserved what he did. But you? You've got time now, time to figure out who you are without fear, time to build something better." Time. Mabel had never thought of time as a gift before. It had always been something to endure, minutes and hours to survive until she could sleep and forget for a while. But now, stretching ahead of her, was a future without Royce. 6 months until the divorce was finalized, yes, but effectively immediately given the restraining order and his impending banishment. Time to heal, to grow, to discover what life looked like when you weren't busy protecting your body from the person who'd promised to love it. The 3 weeks of Royce's imprisonment passed faster than Mabel expected. She marked them in small victories, a full night's sleep without nightmares, a conversation where she didn't automatically defer to male opinion, a morning when she looked in the mirror and recognized something like strength in her own reflection. The ranch became truly home instead of just refuge, her room accumulating small comforts she bought with her cooking wages. A real pillow, curtains for the window, a hook for her mother's photograph. Building a life, brick by careful brick. Colt kept his promise of courtship with old-fashioned formality that would have been comical if it weren't so touching. He brought her wildflowers from the high meadows, their stems wrapped in wet cloth to keep them fresh. Sat with her on the cookhouse steps after supper, talking about nothing important, weather, horses, the novels he'd read and she'd never had time for. Asked permission before taking her hand, respected her space when she needed solitude, showed up steady and patient and utterly without demand. It was courting as protection, as healing, as proof that men could be gentle if they chose. On the day Royce was released from jail, Mabel woke with her stomach in knots despite knowing she was safe. Hodges had sent word the previous evening Royce would be escorted to the settlement to collect his few belongings, given 3 days to leave the territory, and warned one final time about the consequences of violating the restraining order. After that, he'd be someone else's problem, some other town's drunk, fading into the anonymity of the West where men could disappear and reinvent themselves or drink themselves to death, without anyone keeping score. Mabel went through her morning routine by rote, hands busy while her mind raced. What if he didn't leave? What if he came to the ranch one last time, gun in hand, determined to take her with him or ensure nobody else could have her? Men had done worse for less, and Royce had never been particularly stable even before the humiliation of public defeat and imprisonment. Colt found her mid-morning, white-knuckling a bread bowl and staring at nothing. "He's gone," he said without preamble. Hodges just rode by to confirm. Royce collected his gear, bought a train ticket east, and left on the 10 o'clock. The sheriff watched him board personally. "It's over, Mabel. He's gone." The bread bowl slipped from her hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud that scattered flour like snow. Mabel stood frozen, unable to process the words. Gone. Just gone. Not dead, not arrested again, not lurking in the shadows waiting for his chance. Simply gone, vanished into the vast American landscape like he'd never existed at all. You're sure? Her voice came out small, childlike. I'm sure. Hodges said he looked defeated, beaten, like a dog that finally learned it couldn't win. Colt moved closer, and this time when his hands came to her shoulders, Mabel leaned into the touch instead of enduring it. You're free, Mabel. Really, truly free. He can't touch you anymore. The tears came then, hot and overwhelming, years of terror and tension releasing all at once. Colt held her through it, let her sob into his shirt until she was wrung out and empty and clean. When she finally pulled back, sniffling and mortified, he just handed her his bandana with a gentle smile. Sorry, she managed, wiping her face. I don't know why I'm crying. I should be happy. You are happy. Sometimes happiness just looks like crying because you've been holding so much in for so long that when it finally breaks free, it takes everything with it. He cupped her face, thumbs brushing away tears with a tenderness that made her chest ache. You survived, Mabel. Against odds that would have broken most people, you survived. That's worth crying about. The days that followed Royce's departure felt like learning to walk after years of crawling. Everything was the same. The cookhouse, the cowboys, the endless Montana sky. But everything felt different too. Mabel moved through the world with less fear, slept deeper, laughed at jokes she wouldn't have dared find funny before. The bruises faded completely, and with them went the last visible evidence of what she'd endured. Only the scars remained, and even those grew less angry over time, settling into her skin like stories written in a language only she could fully read. The divorce was finalized on a cold January morning, 6 months to the day after the hearing. Mabel received the papers via courier. Legal documents that transformed her from Mrs. Royce Danner to simply Mabel Crowley again, as if the intervening years had been a fever dream she could now wake from. She read them twice, then folded them carefully and placed them in her trunk next to her mother's photograph. Proof that endings were real, that women could escape, that the law occasionally worked the way it was supposed to. That evening, Colt took her to dinner at the hotel restaurant in Dust Creek, a gesture so normal and domestic it felt revolutionary. They ate steak and potatoes while townspeople watched with varying degrees of curiosity and judgment, and Mabel held her head high, refusing to hide or apologize for choosing survival over suffering. Some of the women nodded to her as they passed, the ones who understood, who'd lived their own versions of violence, and their solidarity meant more than 1,000 words. How does it feel? Colt asked over coffee. Being officially unmarried? Like I can breathe all the way down to my toes. Mabel smiled, surprised by how easy it felt. Like I'm starting over at 26 with nothing but what I can carry, and somehow that's everything I need. Not nothing, Colt corrected gently. You've got a job, a home, friends, and, if you're still agreeable, a man who's been courting you for months and would very much like to know if he's got a chance at something more permanent. The question hung in the warm air between them, weighted with hope and fear, and the kind of vulnerability that came from offering your heart to someone who'd had theirs broken before. Mabel looked at him across the table, this quiet, solid man who'd fought for her when fighting mattered, who'd given her space to heal, who'd shown her that gentleness wasn't weakness and protection didn't require possession. I'm agreeable, she said softly, more than agreeable. But Colt, I need you to understand, I'm still figuring out who I am without fear. Some days I'm strong, and some days I'm a mess. And I don't know how to be someone's wife again without remembering what that meant before. Then don't be a wife, he said simply. Be Mabel, be yourself, and let me be the man who gets to stand beside you while you figure the rest out. No expectations, no demands, just partnership. Two people choosing each other every day because they want to, not because they have to. Partnership. The word settled over Mabel like a warm blanket, promising equality instead of ownership, choice instead of obligation. This was what marriage should have been all along, two people building something together, both having equal say, both responsible for making it work. I'd like that, she whispered. Very much. They married on a spring morning when the plains had turned green and wildflowers painted the meadows in impossible colors. Not a big ceremony, just the ranch hands, Doc Patterson, Sheriff Hodges, and the minister from Dust Creek's Methodist Church, who'd made it clear he thought Mabel was a good woman who'd gotten a raw deal and deserved a second chance at happiness. They exchanged vows in the ranch yard with mountains as witnesses, and when Colt slipped a new ring on her finger, gold this time, with a small sapphire that caught light like captured sky, Mabel felt something inside her click into place. Not completion, because she'd learned she didn't need a man to be whole, but rightness, the sense of having chosen well, finally, after years of choices made from desperation. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle, respectful, utterly unlike the claiming kisses Royce had subjected her to. This was an asking, an offering, a promise made with soft lips and warm hands, and the kind of patience that said they had all the time in the world to figure out the rest. When they pulled apart, the cowboys cheered and Sheriff Hodges fired his gun in the air in celebration, and Mabel laughed, really laughed, deep and free, for what felt like the first time in her adult life. They moved into a small house Colt had been quietly building on ranch land, just a mile from the cookhouse so Mabel could still work but far enough to feel separate and private. It wasn't much. 2 rooms, a good stove, windows that actually fit their frames, but to Mabel it was a palace, a home she'd chosen, with a man she'd chosen, where locked doors meant privacy instead of protection, and raised voices were for calling dinner, not signaling danger. The first night in their house, Mabel stood at the window watching the sun set in bands of gold and crimson, and Colt came up behind her, wrapping arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. Not trapping, just present. She leaned back into his warmth, feeling safe in a way she'd forgotten was possible. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me when I was invisible, for fighting when I was too tired, for making me believe I deserved better than breaking." She turned in his arms, meeting his eyes directly. "For being the kind of man who proves that gentle doesn't mean weak, and protection doesn't mean possession." "Thank you," he countered, "for surviving long enough to give me the chance, for being brave when brave seemed impossible, for teaching me that sometimes saving someone means saving yourself too." They stood there as darkness fell and stars emerged, 2 damaged people who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided to build something new. The past would always be part of them, Mabel's scars, Colt's memories, the ghosts they'd carry forward. But the past didn't own them anymore. They'd taken its lessons, its pain, its hard-won wisdom, and transmuted it into something stronger. The knowledge that survival was possible, that healing took time but was worth the effort, that love could be gentle if you chose gentle people. The years that followed were good in the quiet, unremarkable way that mattered most. Mabel continued cooking for the ranch, expanding her role until she was managing the whole cookhouse operation and teaching younger women the skills she'd honed. Colt became a partner in the Lazy M, his reputation as a fair but firm foreman making the ranch prosper. They built a life together, not the dramatic sweep-you-off-your-feet kind from novels, but the steady, enduring kind where showing up mattered more than grand gestures and choosing each other daily was the real romance. They never heard from Royce again. Rumors occasionally drifted back. He'd been seen in Kansas, drinking himself to death in Denver, dead in a brawl in some nameless town where nobody cared enough to record it properly. Mabel didn't care which story was true. Royce was her past, and she'd worked too hard building her future to waste time looking backward. She learned to garden, planting herbs and vegetables in the good soil behind their house, learned to ride properly instead of just enduring the wagon, learned to speak up in town, to give her opinion in ranch decisions, to take up space without apologizing for existing. Most importantly, she learned that strength wasn't about never being afraid. It was about being afraid and doing the necessary thing anyway, about surviving when survival seemed impossible, about choosing life again and again, even when death or surrender looked easier. On a morning 10 years after that courthouse hearing, Mabel woke to find Colt already up, standing at their window watching the sunrise paint the plains in shades of copper and gold. She joined him, slipping her hand into his, and together they watched the day begin. Her hair had some gray now, and lines had appeared around her eyes from smiling instead of flinching. She was 36, middle-aged by territory standards, and she'd never been happier. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How far we've come." You especially. He squeezed her hand. Remember that first morning when I fixed your door and you looked at me like I was crazy for caring? I remember. I thought you were trying to trap me into owing you something. And now? Now I know you were just being human, doing what decent people do when they see someone suffering, helping without expecting payment. She leaned against him, comfortable in his presence. You saved my life, Colt. Not by fighting Royce, though that helped, but by making me believe I was worth saving. That changed everything. You saved yourself, he corrected gently. I just held the door open while you walked through. Maybe that was true. Maybe they'd saved each other, two people drowning who'd grabbed the same rope and pulled themselves to shore together. It didn't really matter anymore. What mattered was that they'd made it, that they'd built something good from terrible foundations, that they'd proven broken things could mend if given time and care and the space to heal. That afternoon, a dust storm rolled across the plains, the kind that turned day to twilight and rattled windows with wind that tasted of grit and distance. Mabel was preparing supper when she heard something crash outside, metal tearing in the gale. She looked out to see tin panels ripping free from the cookhouse roof, threatening to shred themselves in anything they hit. The old Mabel would have hidden inside, waiting for a man to fix it, would have made herself small and hoped the storm passed without noticing her. But the woman she'd become grabbed her coat and headed out into the wind, determined to save what she'd built, even if it meant fighting weather that didn't care about her determination. She was halfway up the cookhouse ladder when Colt appeared, fighting his way through the gusts with panic written across his face. "Mabel, get down! It's too dangerous!" "I can do it!" she shouted back, climbing higher. "I've got it!" But a particularly vicious gust nearly tore her from the rungs, and suddenly Colt was climbing up behind her, not to pull her down, but to help. They worked together in the screaming wind, wrestling tin back into place and nailing it down with hands that went numb from cold and effort. It was brutal, exhausting work, and twice they almost lost their grip. But they didn't stop, didn't surrender, just kept fighting until the roof was secure and the storm had nothing left to tear away. Afterward, they collapsed in the cookhouse kitchen, bruised and filthy and triumphant. Mabel put coffee on with shaking hands while Colt built up the fire, and they sat at her work table drinking in silence that felt like victory. "You could have been killed," Colt said finally, "but I wasn't. Because I'm not fragile anymore." Mabel looked at her scraped palms, at the new bruises that were badges of accomplishment instead of abuse. 10 years ago, I would have let that roof blow away rather than risk myself. Would have believed my safety mattered less than avoiding danger. But you know what I realized up there? What? That I'm not yours to break. She met his eyes, seeing understanding dawn. Not because you would break me, you wouldn't, but because I'm mine, my life, my choices, my risks to take. And if I want to climb on a roof during a dust storm to save something I've built, that's my right. Just like it's my right to accept help without feeling weak. Colt smiled, slow and proud. There she is. The woman who was always there, just buried under fear. I'm glad you found her again. We found her, Mabel corrected. Together. They finished their coffee as the storm blew itself out, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and strange. Through the windows, the sky cleared to impossible blue, and in that light, Mabel saw their reflection in the glass. Two people who'd survived storms, literal and metaphorical, who'd fought when fighting mattered and healed when healing was possible, who'd learned that happy endings weren't about perfection, but about choosing each other, choosing life, choosing to believe that sometimes, against all odds and common sense, broken people could mend, and broken situations could transform, and women who'd been told they were nothing could discover they'd been everything all along. The fear that had ruled Mabel's life for years was gone, burned away in the flames of a shack nobody mourned, dissolved in the tears she'd cried into Colt's shoulder, scoured out by years of choosing courage over cowering. What remained was a free woman, scarred, yes, but unbroken. And a man who'd learned that the best way to honor his mother's memory wasn't to rescue every damaged woman he met, but to help one woman learn to rescue herself. As the Montana sky turned copper and gold with approaching evening, Mabel gripped Colt's hand and said aloud the words she'd whispered that day on the cookhouse roof, the words that had become her truth, her armor, her declaration of independence. I'm not yours to break. The fear that had haunted her was gone. What remained was simply Mabel, cook, survivor, wife, woman, standing in the life she'd claimed through blood and tears, and the stubborn refusal to accept that suffering was destiny. And beside her stood Colt, not a head pulling her forward or behind pushing her onward, but shoulder to shoulder, walking together into whatever came next, bound not by law or obligation, but by the fierce, fragile, beautiful choice to keep choosing each other, one day at a time for all the days they were given. The storm had passed. The damage was repaired. And in the quiet that followed, two people who'd learned that survival was just the beginning discovered what came after. A life worth living, a love worth fighting for, and the revolutionary belief that broken things, given time and care and the space to heal, could become stronger at the mended places than they'd ever been whole.